Thank you very much, Jesse. So, one of the most disturbing consequences of this precipitous downturn that we've seen in the US-China relationship is the impact that it's having and is likely going to continue to have on scientific collaboration, on research collaboration. What we're all witnessing right now, I mean, really the very reason that we're doing this on Zoom and not in person in a Tony venue in San Francisco as was originally planned, is really directly related to a failure of, or maybe perhaps a failure to fully leverage scientific collaboration. Just yesterday, I read a fantastic New Yorker article that detailed missed opportunities and featured a Wuhan virologist named Zhengli Shi and her collaborator, the American scientist Peter Daszak, and how they had identified a bat coronavirus with spiky proteins capable of binding with the ACE2 receptors. And they had alerted the world of it 3 years ago, and unfortunately had gone largely unheeded. Yet today, as many scientists are very keenly aware, there is an even greater need for collaboration. Even though that is the case, the prospects for it seem dimmer, unfortunately, than ever. Misguided policies, not just from Washington, but also from Beijing, have thrown up a number of very serious impediments to that collaboration. So today, we've put together a tremendous panel that is going to explore many facets of this topic: national security and industrial espionage concerns, and how they have ballooned, Chinese state-sponsored programs like Thousand Talents, but also we're going to talk about ways in which collaboration might continue. So let me quickly introduce our fantastic panelists. First is Nelson Dong. Nelson is a senior partner at Dorsey and Whitney LLP in its Seattle office, where his practice focuses on technology companies, universities, and research institutions, helping them with U.S. national security and export control regulations on technology transfers, and international law matters. He was a White House fellow and special assistant to U.S. Attorney General Griffin Bell during the Carter administration, and later served as Deputy Associate Attorney General and as a federal prosecutor in Boston before returning to private practice. Mara Fistendahl is an investigative reporter with The Intercept, a new job. Congratulations. She worked for many years as a science reporter in China and is the author of Unnatural Selection, about the global impact of sex selection, and most recently of The Scientist and the Spy. I highly recommend that title in particular for this, because it really illustrates the issues that we face both from Chinese industrial espionage and from the overreaction and overreach of federal law enforcement here. It does the rarest of things when it comes to writing on China. It offers a proper sense of proportion. If you can't buy the book, at least listen to the podcast that I recorded in Mara just a few months ago, back before the world changed. Maggie Lewis is professor at Seton Hall University at the School of Law there. Her research focuses on law in mainland China and Taiwan, with an emphasis on criminal justice. And you should also listen to a podcast that I recorded with her just after the Taiwan election, at which she was an observer. It's a really great listen. And finally, we have Rory Truex, assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. In recent months, Rory has taken a very keen interest in the topic of how relatively open and relatively closed political systems can coexist, and has some concrete proposals specific to U.S.-Chinese scientific cooperation that we will discuss anon. So welcome to all of our panelists. I am Kaiser Guo of the Sinica podcast on SupChina, and I want to thank everyone tuning in from all over the world. So Nelson, let us start with you, because you're somebody who's seen scientific collaboration between the U.S. and China go from basically zero prior to reform and opening back in 1979, when you were still at the Department of Justice, to a peak, really, in recent years. Give us a sense, if possible, about the scope and the timing of expansion of Chinese student enrollment at U.S. research and over the past, I guess, 4 decades, and how that has really laid the foundations for so much of the research collaboration that's happened between the U.S. and China as more of these students join the faculties of American schools. What are the areas of collaboration from the good old days that had been most fruitful, would you say?
So I think, to put some context around this, the U.S. university system really was the most prominent in the world at the end of World War II, primarily because it was the only one standing in a viable economic system. Europe had collapsed, much of Asia was in ruins after the war. And so universities in the United States began slowly opening up to foreign student enrollment. Probably in the early 1950s, we had roughly 50,000 foreign students studying in American universities in the aggregate. Today, we have well over a million foreign students studying in our universities. So you can see quite a massive increase year on year between the end of the 1950s and today, at least until the COVID-19 situation really impacted that. As a result of so many foreign students coming to the US, not exclusively from China, but initially early years from Europe and other places, then there was a spike in enrollment from the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia. And now in more recent years, roughly 1/3 of all foreign students in the US are from China. So when you put that many people into American universities, particularly in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, that produces a huge wave of potential job candidates, and American universities have continued to recruit heavily. And so you find what might seem at first blush a disproportionate representation of Chinese and Indian students who have done very well at Caltech and MIT and Berkeley and so on around the country, and they decide that they will stay in the United States. And so that feeds a huge STEM workforce in the United States, where roughly 1/4 of all of our STEM PhDs are from China, and 1/4 are from India, 1/4 are from the rest of the world put together, and about 1/4 are American-born students. And so that produces a really distinctive demographic within the STEM workforce of the country and really lays the foundation for the things we're going to talk about today.
Terrific. What in particular, what areas have you seen really fruitful collaboration in?
Well, I think the easy ones are the ones that China itself and the United States both value very much. And so in the areas of engineering, particularly electrical engineering and computer science, in mathematics, in medicine and biology, all of those fields, there's been fairly extensive cooperation. Many of the largest professional societies and organizations in this area, such as the IEEE, the ASME, and others, American Chemical Society, American Physical Society, a very large proportion of their memberships today are individuals who born in China, teach in China, work in China, and they really participate at the very top of all of these professions.
Right, right. Mara, during these years, obviously there were cases of actual espionage on the one extreme, as well as perhaps less serious ethical violations like unreported funding and so on. There were also a lot of, there's also a lot of perfectly legal soft transfer. More than a decade ago, I remember, I mean, maybe to Nelson's point, I was a reporter doing a piece on life sciences R&D efforts in China. And one source of mine quipped that American universities, life sciences departments at American universities basically now exist to transfer knowledge from old Jewish men to young Chinese women, which was certainly seemed to be the case. U.S. law enforcement pursued cases as far back as I can remember in the 80s, in the early 80s, and in the 90s. But my sense is things didn't really heat up until more recently, really in the Obama administration. Is that correct, Mara? And what was it that triggered the real intensification of this focus in pre-Trump times?
Sure. Well, it was a few things that contributed to this shift. One is just the general shift in US-China relations toward a more antagonistic relationship. The other is a shift in sentiment in the business community. So, before the late aughts, many businesses felt that if they just kind of waited things out in China, that they would eventually break into the market. And eventually that became clear that that was not the case. And so many companies became more willing to bring accusations of industrial espionage and work with the FBI. But the other issue is that there's been this change within the FBI from being more of a law enforcement organization to an organization that's focused on counterintelligence. That's a shift that began after 9/11 and that it continues to today. And so with some of these economic espionage and IP theft cases, you see tools like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is intended to be used for issues of terrorism and extreme national security threats, being used as a tool to collect evidence and information in cases involving technology. And those are some of the tools that I went into in my book. I looked at a case of a man who had been accused of stealing genetically modified corn from Monsanto, and the idea was that the company that he worked for was trying to get several different strains of this next generation hybrid corn, bring it back to China and reverse engineer it. And what's notable about that case is that there was a lot of visibility into it, so you could see some of these tools that the FBI used to investigate him. And in that sense, I think it's fairly representative of some other cases. It's just unique that we had all this visibility into it.
And that started I think that it was 2014 was when I became aware of that.
2011.
2011.
But the Economic Espionage Unit was formed within the FBI in 2009. There were a few prominent cases right before that. And then today we're at the point where FBI Director Christopher Wray recently said we have over 1,000 active investigations involving China.
Right. Maggie, let's talk about this China initiative, which has really been the main push from the Department of Justice to ferret out espionage and other nefarious activity by Chinese researchers in American institutions. When did that get started? What was the impetus for that? And what was the broader context for that push emerging?
Thanks, Kaiser. Yeah, so the China initiative started actually in November of 2018, which isn't that long ago, but it feels like a long time ago right now. And that was when it was, of course, Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General. And the idea there was sort of crystallizing, bringing together these trends that Mara talked about that were already going on well before the Trump administration. But it not only gave name to this as the China initiative, which is very strange for the Department of Justice and the FBI as part of DOJ to name a major initiative after a country. And one thing that concerns me is it gives this idea that there is this malign actor called China, when of course federal prosecutions are against individuals, whether that be natural persons or companies, but we don't actually have China being a defendant, for example. But this idea that China, the PRC party state, was behind not only economic espionage, which is this idea that there is a trade secret theft, but the beneficiary of that, or the intended beneficiary, is a foreign government or some entity associated with that foreign government. And as Mara mentioned, sort of the National Security Division within the Department of Justice is relatively new. That's post 9/11. It was only in the mid-90s that even economic espionage was added to the US code as a federal crime. And so this is not, that long ago that we didn't even have this conception that trade secret theft benefiting a foreign government was a federal crime. But in November of 2018, we get this idea that there needs to be a more concerted effort, a clearer effort, and that's expanded beyond just economic espionage to these other concerns about, as like the 1,000 Talents program, which I'll let other people speak to, but that there are ties by US researchers, academics, others to China that they're not disclosing, which can give rise to charges like obstruction of justice or federal reporting requirements that haven't been met. Now, this program has gained momentum under Attorney General Barr. As mentioned, Christopher Wray, director of the FBI, has stated openly that there's approximately 1,000 investigations. That's probably slowed somewhat under COVID, but it's harder to do those investigations. But certainly there's a lot in the pipeline that's heading towards prosecutors and could result in charges. I'm sure a number of those won't result in charges because of attrition, but there's a lot coming down the pike. And I just, a few points in general about the China initiative, which I'm very concerned about, but I do want to make clear that the Department of Justice is not making up that there is a threat. You know, there are people associated with the PRC party state who are engaged in trade secret theft and other activities that are illegal under US law. But I'm really concerned about the way the US government is framing that threat, responding to it, and in particular that it makes it so even though every element still needs to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt to secure a conviction, it gives this sense that people who are connected to China via DNA or their passport or other aspects somehow have this negative China-ness to them. Right. And that's only being amplified under COVID, where we see not just sort of anti-China sentiment, but anti-Asian American sentiment. And I know that there are people, I've spoken with people in DOJ who are genuine when they say, you know, we welcome Chinese people, this is not against the Chinese people, but that's not enough to serve as an antidote to this framing. And I think it invalidates sometimes this feeling of that people are not welcome. And you can't just say, oh, no, it's not against you and make everything okay. Right. I think that there's a real issue there.
That certainly is. And the China initiative isn't the only thing that the Trump administration has tried to name after China. Of course, you know, he started calling it the Chinese virus for a little while. Rory, for years, Beijing criticized the U.S. for allegedly nurturing this China threat theory. Now it's pretty hard to fault Beijing for saying that. The China threat theory seems alive and well and is talked about quite regularly. We've mentioned Christopher Wray now and the claim that there are 1,000 active cases. He also very famously said before a Senate Intelligence Committee that we need to meet this whole of society threat from China with a whole of society response here in the United States. This has clearly been amplified, I think, in the age of COVID-19, even if cases are down. While one might think that this is a global pandemic, that it should be a clarion call, I think, for deeper collaboration. That is not the way that things are playing out at all. What are your thoughts, Rory, on the impact of COVID-19 on the likely impact of it on the future of research collaboration?
Thank you, Kaiser. I would start by just sort of clarifying some of this language around whole of society, because I think it's important. So in his comments to the Senate Intelligence Committee, Wray said, and I quote, "I think this is, in this setting, meaning academia, I would just say that the use of non-traditional collectors, especially in the academic setting, whether it's professors, scientists, students, we see in almost every field office that the FBI has around the country." And so this phrase non-traditional collectors is basically saying that there are people working with and for the Chinese government that we would consider professors or students or other things like this. And as Mara and Maggie and Nelson have all said, there is, of course, some degree of this going on. And I think what was particularly alarming was that second half of his comment, which was about the whole of society approach on the US side. And this is basically translates to asking universities, right, in the form of administrators, faculty, other researchers to, quote, do their part in combating this intelligence risk. And that language is worrisome for a number of reasons, building on what some of the comments Maggie was saying. First, my personal feeling is I don't think, even if universities wanted to partake in this and really fully assist the FBI, I don't think universities or individual faculty members would be well positioned to collect reasonable and reliable intelligence. And then, of course, the more obvious point is that this type of language creates this environment of distrust and discrimination. The FBI has a tendency to use security language so they'll describe people who are Chinese as foreign adversaries. And that language in academia is just completely foreign. And I think for faculty members, for university administrators to start describing our students and collaborators who are Chinese as adversaries is deeply problematic. And to go to Nelson's point, there's kind of a two-pronged problem here. On the one hand, we need citizens from China to beef up our STEM workforce. They're 25% of our PhDs. If for whatever reason that flow were to decrease, that would have major implications for US competitiveness. And on the other hand, there is this problem of espionage and academic theft. And if you try to solve the academic theft problem with heightened surveillance, monitoring, collaboration with the FBI, it's going to erode technological competitiveness by encouraging Chinese researchers to not come to the United States for their PhDs or to return home afterwards. And so to me, there's this very clear trade-off. And what I'm worried about with the FBI is that it does seem particularly myopic in focusing just on reducing the espionage component and not thinking about the broader implications. In terms of COVID, I think it's too early to say. I think in general, the direction seems that there is going to be, I think scientists will push back against this. I think there's a realization among the scientists. It's been heartwarming to see, as someone who's a political scientist who's just sort of on the sidelines of this, the scientific community in full gear, working together and collaborating and trying to figure out this global issue. So I think I'm perhaps a little optimistic that the scientific community will figure out a way to persist and collaborate despite the two governments trying to put some limitations on that.
Well, Roy, just now you talked about how the focus on national security concerns has probably dissuaded a lot of Chinese people from pursuing research collaboration with their American counterparts. On the other side of it, I think we've seen now people like Charles Lieber of Harvard University being prosecuted now for his involvement in universities in China and not reporting. This may have something of a chilling effect, I imagine, on American researchers who are contemplating scientific collaboration with China, if indeed it has not already had such an effect. All of you talk to a lot of people, in the scientific community. What are you getting? Are you getting a sense that there's increasing nervousness about collaborating with the Chinese, not, as we've suggested, having the tools to be able to ferret out who the good actors are and the bad actors, and then feeling a lot of, like it could really affect the way that they're funded. They're pulling NIH and all these other organizations are threatening to pull grants, federal grants, from universities that don't play ball on this front. Is there a chilling effect on the American side? Anyone?
I can jump in on that.
Yeah, please.
So, I teach U.S. criminal law and criminal procedure, and the fancy way that we say chilling effect is general deterrence, right? This theory of criminal law that by punishing an individual, it'll deter others from engaging in behavior that we don't want. And you mentioned Professor Lieber and Andrew Lelling, who's the U.S. attorney for Massachusetts and based in Boston. So he was in charge of bringing that prosecution. He said, and I'm going to quote him directly because I don't want to get this wrong, that when speaking about these letters from the National Institutes of Health, sort of warning people who were grantees to be careful about their ties to China, that Lelling said, I think those letters have had an interim effect, and that's good because you want a little bit of fear out there to sensitize people to the magnitude of the problem. So it's very clear that DOJ is trying to use this deterrence, and to that end, I think it's good that people who have grants are sensitized to what are best practices with respect to security. I have no problem with that. I think perhaps we've been too lax and haven't done enough audits and enough education about how are those best practices. However, I have real concerns about using the heavy hammer of the criminal law as the way to sensitize people to this threat, to take away people's liberty and have this massive, what I think could be over-deterrence, that there should be a response, but whether federal prosecutions is the way that you're going to get the sweet spot of not too much deterrence, I really question that.
Am I being maybe too paranoid or cynical in suggesting that given this administration's rush to decouple, that this might be precisely the point? The chilling effect is the idea that it'll sort of accelerate the decoupling that's already such a core piece of their agenda.
Well, if I can jump in.
Please.
Yeah, it's not, the issue is not just prosecutions. At least when you have a prosecution, the charges are laid out in the indictment. you know what the person's accused of. But there have also been instances of the FBI coming into institutions, working with administrators over a number of months. And you know, the administrators and the NIH are under a lot of pressure from Congress to root out IP theft. And so the FBI will come in and spend months investigating people. And there have been cases where this has led to no charges. The one that I know the most about is the MD Anderson Cancer Center, right. Where investigators spent 18 months looking into various scientists there who had not reported their, or were accused of not reporting their grants they were receiving in China. And from what I could find, there were a few instances of double dipping, but nobody was charged with anything. There was this kind of cloud of suspicion that was cast over many Chinese American scientists at the institution, and some even from Taiwan and Hong Kong. So a number of people left either because they were, you know, just felt like they were being targeted, or because the climate had become so fraught. You know, they, for example, had nothing to worry about themselves, but they were being brought in and questioned about their colleagues, or they were working with somebody who was under investigation. And so the end result was just this kind of massive departure of a number of very valuable scientists, and no charges, and just a lot of questions. You know, at one point the FBI installed a security camera outside a researcher's door. There were possession of child pornography charges kind of dangled in one case, and then those were dropped, and it was passed from state to local authorities. And so, I mean, that's an example of how not to do this. And especially in cases where the main concern is double dipping and grant fraud, people not reporting affiliations in China, you know, we could be much more productive for the NIH or the FBI as needed to go in and talk with administrators and say, you know, can you make clear to researchers they need to report these ties going forward, and to try to kind of take care of that internally to avoid some of these deleterious effects.
Mm-hmm. Your research at the MD Anderson Cancer Center focused on a lot of cases that were brought about, as you said, double dipping, about grant fraud, about things like that. But these are so often, it seems, at least in the popular mind, conflated with the more serious allegations of industrial espionage. And there seems to be almost a deliberate conflation of this. And it reminds me of what's been happening in recent weeks, where, you know, the maybe plausible, if not likely, scenario of a laboratory leak from Wuhan is conflated with this idea of bioweapons systems. And you know, I see it constantly. I know that out there in popular understanding, these two things are conflated. Are you seeing that happening right now? Are people confusing the allegations of double dipping, of you know, taking money, of not reporting funding from China, with actual espionage activity? Mara.
Someone else just, oh, for me? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I do, well, prosecutors are very clear on what the specific charges mean, obviously. In terms of the China initiative, and this is something that Maggie can probably speak to with much more authority than I can, and Nelson as well, it does seem like the two are being kind of lumped together into one basket. And so, you know, there is a concern about programs like the 1,000 Talents, because there have been a few instances of scientists who had unreported ties in China who were suspected of actually taking technology or some kind of know-how back to China.
Right. So there's sometimes overlap. Yeah.
There is, but there are also many other cases, and we can talk about this a little bit more later, where, you know, people had collaborations. They had a lab back in China. They weren't reporting, but, you know, maybe they weren't even spending that much time there. And so whether IP is actually being transferred in those cases is really an open question. And they very much are conflated in the popular mind, even in the, I'm a journalist, and when the charges against Charles Lieber were announced, I mean, many people went straight to espionage.
He's a spy. Right?
It was, I think, I should be clear that that's a big case because he was the department chair of the chemistry department at Harvard, and they had caught a very big fish who was his contract had specified that he was making quite a lot of money from his Chinese partner. And so that is significant, but there was, as far as I can tell, no clear evidence of IP being transferred.
Right. So Rory, decoupling seems to be the big goal here. But given the way that American universities actually conduct research, which is really on an open science model for the most part, is it even possible to meaningfully decouple American science from global science or from Chinese science?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, probably the $1 billion question. And I think for me, the answer is a clear no. And I think there's a general lack of understanding in the US policy community and the intelligence community about what exactly science looks like today in American universities and what erecting boundaries around it would actually entail. So what is the open science model? Basically, the idea is that all science, what's known as fundamental research, according to the US government policy, should be open. And that means that it's published for public consumption in journals that anybody can access. The underlying materials are available for replication and are downloadable by anybody. Research that's not published yet is sent out for peer review, and that peer review is blind to nationality. Collaboration occurs at all stages in the process, including early stage collaboration, and it's non-discriminatory. So people are not excluded by their nation of origin in attending conferences and so forth. And so that's the vast majority of research that is being done at American universities in STEM. The alternative is classified research, right? So you deem a certain type of research classified.
Uh-oh. Rory, you've broken up here. We've had our first technical glitch of the day. I'm going to move on, and Rory, hopefully we'll be able to come back to you so you can finish that and talk about open science. But I want to move to Nelson here. The China initiative and the economic espionage issues. The China initiative and the economic espionage issues are only parts of a broader government push to protect U.S. intellectual property interests and to ensure that U.S. taxpayer funds benefit Americans and not other nations such as China. I imagine that these were not such priority issues for U.S. universities in the past. With all this pressure coming down, many institutions, I can't imagine that such a profound shift has come, pushing them to comply with these new rules. So much funding at stake. I can't imagine that this has gone smoothly and without a lot of collateral damage happening. What are some of the issues and the obstacles that the universities are confronting? These people have not been trained in counter-espionage techniques. They've not been investigative reporting about people's funding sources and whatnot. What's the view from these universities, since you talk to so many of them in your day-to-day work?
Sure. So within the university community, almost all of the major funded institutions around the country have received multiple letters from federal funding agencies, such as the Dear Colleague letter that Dr. Francis Collins, the head of NIH, sent out in 2018. And there have been similar letters from the heads of the National Science Foundation, from DARPA, ONR, many of the other federal agencies, USDA. All of them have been aimed at working on this ostensible goal of limiting foreign influence on research. And although it's termed foreign influence, they really mean the potential for leakage of American funded research, that is taxpayer funded research, being taken over by people who are conflicted, people who have a second job, a visiting professorship, and so on. So the primary instrument that universities have for dealing with this issue are questionnaires. And so what you find are universities and research institutes that are freestanding institutes apart from university campuses are dusting off their questionnaire forms and being much more explicit about how they frame the questions and asking their faculty members and researchers to fill them out much more scrupulously. They're going back and double and triple checking them, and then ensuring that when individual PIs, principal investigators, submit grant applications, that their applications make the appropriate level of disclosures. As you can imagine, within the university and research environment, this kind of paperwork is not always well attended to, and some PIs have become somewhat careless in the way they fill out some of these forms and do not always keep them totally current. And so that's become a really big negative. And institutions then have to make decisions and distinctions on the basis of, was this an oversight? Was this accidental? Was this inadvertent? Or was this an intentional omission in order to hide this relationship? And so there's been a whole basket of these conversations around the country, and different institutions and different individuals handle them differently. To the same point that Maggie and Mara and Rory were making earlier, one follows, I think, almost a normal bell curve distribution of intentionality about these situations where scholars don't always do the paperwork that they should. So there are some that are doing it to hide illicit activity, and then at the other end of the curve, you have those who are just truly the proverbial absent-minded professor.
Right. So let's shift the conversation now from Washington, which we've been focused on, to Beijing, and talk about some of the policies that the Chinese government has pursued that have presented obstacles or choked off scientific collaboration. Things like data localization requirements, or of course, internet censorship come very quickly to mind. But Beijing has also been pretty cavalier about the way that it has sought to attract talent. Probably the most prominent and controversial program is something called the 1,000 Talents program. Mara and Maggie, both of you are familiar with it. Maybe both of you can talk a little bit about 1,000 Talents, where it came from, and what the problems with it are. Mara, why don't you start us off?
So 1,000 Talents is an effort to recruit scientists to China. Originally, the goal was to recruit mainly ethnic Chinese scientists back to China full time. And there have been people who say this is just like any other country's recruitment program. The difference is that it is directly overseen by the CCP's organization department. And so in the past few years, the FBI has gotten very interested in it. Excuse me. So when 1,000 Talents was launched in 2008 in China, the focus was on overseas ethnic Chinese scientists who were some of the top in their fields, and trying to recruit them back to China. That was relatively unsuccessful. And for years, when I was with Science as a correspondent in China, we reported on how the program largely did not achieve its goals. So they had to continually change the requirements. So full-time was initially 9 or 12 months, and then that full-time got changed to 6 months so that people could keep a post overseas and still be somehow fulfilling the requirements of 1,000 Talents. One of the main problems is that they do not offer tenure. There is a lot of money in some cases, but if you are a leading scientist, you're not going to go take a position back in China if you do not have tenure. And so then later it was opened up to all overseas scientists, and there was an effort also to recruit non-ethnic Chinese. And there are some people who go for part-time, like 3 months of the year. And where the FBI got interested, my personal feeling is that to some degree it's kind of low-hanging fruit for the FBI, because you did have lists of 1,000 Talents recipients circulating for years. This is something that Chinese science bloggers were trying to point out years ago that some people had not reported their funding to the NIH, but yet they were receiving Thousand Talents money. But as this has become an increasingly politicized issue here, there's been a very concerted effort to go after Thousand Talents recipients. And in some cases, I've looked at cases where people simply considered applying to the Thousand Talents program, or maybe they filled out the application as a favor to somebody, but they had no intention to actually do the program, and then came under investigation because they had applied. So it has become an extremely fraught program. I would advise anybody who's considering it to really think through what applying could mean. Charles Lieber was a Thousand Talents recipient. The way I looked at it for years from China was that it had largely not achieved the aims that the CCP had set out of trying to get scientists to come back to China full time. And also there was a lot of embezzlement and people embezzling, universities in China embezzling money, local officials. And so, to some degree, it's a big racket in both countries at this point.
Right. We're fortunate to have both Maggie and Nelson, who are trained in law. Maybe I could get you both to weigh in. Is it possible to participate in the Thousand Talents program, still hold a faculty position at a research institute in the United States? Is that something that can be done if you're fully transparent?
Go ahead, Maggie.
Yeah.
Well, I think, part of it is what is your agreement with your U.S. university as far as what other posts can you hold? And my sense is with Thousand Talents is that it used to be pretty overt who was participating. And on the China side, they've become less forthcoming with the lists and, realizing that this has become something that's under the microscope. So I think that's kind of become, sort of yesterday's news. And just more generally, there's this concern that if you have connectivity to China, that somehow that's seen as complicity. And I do work in human rights and criminal justice. I'm not someone the Chinese government's trying to get to spend more time in China. But where I get concerned is I see things like Renmin University, huge university, very important. And then it's on the unverified list, which has to do with export controls. And I get that you could be concerned about a physics department or other aspects that might have national security implications. But when a whole university is put on this list of suspicion, it also makes it more difficult to do things like work on collaboration on how to decrease wrongful convictions because of interrogation practices. So again, there's this sense of how are we just using this heavy hammer of this, we have to shut it down, when in fact, we're then cutting off so much important collaboration, not just in the life sciences where we need a vaccine and we need tests to find out, antibodies, but also in these, soft areas like law and political science that have, huge implications for all of our societies outside of the hard sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. Nelson, very briefly, what do you advise your clients when it comes to Thousand Talents? Do you think that it's possible for them to carry out research in the U.S. in areas that maybe aren't so national security sensitive as part of as part of the Thousand Talents program?
Well, my own professional practice doesn't involve usually advising individual faculty members. My clients of our firm are usually the institutions, the employers of these investigators. So the conversations we have about Thousand Talents or any of these other recruitment programs, not just in China, but other countries have them as well, to create incentives for leading scholars to come be visiting professors at their universities. Is really one of good housekeeping, that if you're going to allow faculty to have these things and encourage faculty to have these things, then they have to be able to track who is in what program and what their ostensible conflicts of commitment or conflicts of interest might be. And so institutions are responding to all of these pressures quite obviously and pushing faculty across, especially in the STEM fields, to be much more aware of this kind of surveillance and this monitoring. I think it's bound to deter a number of people from signing up. But I think as institutions go through their records, and they are finding more instances where their faculty have not been totally careful and totally sometimes candid with the employer.
Yeah, so Nelson, staying with you, we've been talking about this mainly as a bilateral issue, but the U.S. and China obviously are not the only countries that are producing world-class scientists, and certainly not the only countries that collaborate internationally. Can you talk about the travails of Sino-American scientific collaboration and how those are impacting other countries?
Well, I think several of us have used the phrase "whole of government," and at the sort of the front end of the pipeline, if you will, the United States under this administration has really reduced the number of available student visas for students coming from China, and so many of them are cut off, right at the beginning, and many are not having their visas extended, to permit them to finish their course of study and so on. So gradually, all of this is deflecting a lot of scientific and engineering talent to other countries that are more than happy to have these very highly qualified individuals. So the leading countries that have been the beneficiaries of this diversion have been places like the UK, Canada, Australia, English-speaking countries where there's really almost of interchangeability at the level of research universities that we're talking about. It's hard to contend that, if you had a postdoc at Cambridge, it's somehow less worthy than a postdoc at Princeton. These are all in that upper echelon of research universities, and these other countries are more than happy to open their doors and take the scientists and others that we won't allow to stay or come to the United States.
Understandably, and Princeton. Sorry about that, Rory. Rory, I want to get through this quickly because we have a number of very good questions from attendees that I'd hoped to get to, but very little time left. So, Rory, you've proposed a set of guiding principles, and in particular, 4 policy solutions that are aimed at reducing the illicit flow of IP from U.S. universities to China. Can you quickly go through those 4 and maybe get some reaction from some of the other participants to those proposed solutions and how workable they are?
Yeah. The general feeling I think is that universities and academics can't simply just ignore this threat, and there needs to be some cooperation between the intelligence community and the academic community on this issue. But it needs to be done with certain terms in mind. And so in terms of underlying principles of how I was thinking about it, first, any policy solution has to, it has to be non-discriminatory. So nothing should be adopted that fosters systematic discrimination against the Chinese population. The second is we must recognize the importance of foreign-born researchers and Chinese research in particular to the U.S. economy. So we can't simply say, oh, we don't want these students. I think that would be a foolish endeavor. Then third, we must acknowledge that our model of science has unavoidable vulnerabilities. So the idea of reducing espionage or reducing plagiarism or theft of any kind to zero is effectively impossible. And so we need to mitigate it, to manage it, but to realize that this is just the way we do business, and that's got some risks to it, and that's okay.
So these are the principles.
Those are the principles. So in terms of policy solutions, and I'm still working on these. The first thing we haven't talked much about is what happens to Americans or other foreigners when they are in China. And there's increasing evidence that younger students, undergraduates, graduate students, and other Americans traveling in China can become targets of Chinese intelligence and trying to cultivate relationships with those Americans for later in life. This is a real problem, and it's never happened to me personally, but I know students who have been approached while in China in a very suspect way. It seems that they're trying to be cultivated. So sure. I think a relatively low-hanging fruit would be for the FBI and universities to collaborate and offer some pre-travel counterintelligence training module, 10 to 20 minutes that U.S. citizens could take, and then they would be a little bit more savvy when on the ground in China and figure out how to conduct themselves and certain risks to be aware of. I think that's something that everybody could agree on would be productive. The second policy solution is what I would call centralized disclosure analysis. So one of the issues, every faculty member at most universities has to complete these forms at the end of every year, which are conflict of interest, conflict of commitment forms. Now the issue is I think a lot of faculty don't take them very seriously. Faculty members who are getting NIH or NSF grants have to complete other forms of that nature for those grants, and the whole thing can be quite cumbersome. And so I think, in an ideal world, there will be a centralized system where every faculty member in the United States completes one form, and that form can be used to populate grants for NIH and NSF as across universities, and there would be an understanding that the community have access to those forms. And that might seem like an invasion of privacy, but I think the reality is the current system is a patchwork system, and it's not working. And so I think it seems like a reasonable path forward that I think everybody could agree to improve change. The third thing I would say is that I think we need to reduce expectations of universities to engage in surveillance and monitoring. I think the language coming from the FBI, the whole of society language, the foreign adversary language, I think that's extremely counterproductive and short-sighted and unrealistic. And so I would encourage, universities to push back on expectations for surveillance. The FBI and other institutions should have access to universities, but we shouldn't be tasked with collecting intelligence on their behalf.
That's right.
And then the final thing, which is probably the most controversial, is that I think there should be a no dual salary rule, meaning that no full-time employee of an American university should receive salary or substantial compensation from the Chinese government, military, universities, or state-owned enterprises. And I think what's interesting with the case of Charles Lieber, correct me if I'm wrong, Mara and Maggie, that he's being charged with the crime here is that he didn't disclose his relationship with the Wuhan University of Technology. But the relationship itself doesn't quite sit right with a lot of folks. And the fact that he can receive $50,000 a month or whatever it was from another university while still being a full-time faculty member at Harvard, to me is problematic and represents a conflict of commitment, meaning that he's not fully committed to his own institution, which is Harvard. And so I think there needs to be some real hard thinking about what, university professors are allowed to receive compensation from firms, other institutions. But I think there needs to be some real hard thinking as to what is permissible and what is not. So I'll stop there. I spoke too long, and I know we have a ton of good questions.
Great. Any remarks on Rory's 4 proposals? Do they all seem sensible to you? Is there anything that you in particular object to or find that would be really difficult to actually implement? Nelson, anything?
Sure. The one comment about standardizing the disclosure forms is already a project of Dr. Kelvin Drogemeyer, who's the science advisor to the president. OSTP is now working to try to bring some uniformity to the disclosures across the agencies that provide federal funding for PIs.
Okay, great.
There are a couple of questions here that I've seen that relate to the social sciences. And I know that Rory, sticking with you, because you have done a lot of research. You wrote a terrific paper along with a colleague at the University of Missouri to Sheena Greitens, looking at the accusations of academic self-censorship, among other things. We've done a show about that. But could you talk a little bit about social science research collaboration, and especially to the plight of of American scholars who are trying to do field research in China?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The reality is for the national security community in the United States, social science research, frankly, doesn't matter that much. It doesn't have the same national security implications, technology implications. The level of grant money is a fraction of what is in STEM. And so it's really not on the radar, and a collaboration from someone like me with a Chinese counterpart is not as sensitive to the US government, but it might be actually equally sensitive to the Chinese government. And I think that's, or more. And so that's, and Maggie spoke to this as well. I think there is a shift in the climate in mainland China about social science research. Social science in mainland China is quite far behind, especially research on China in China is very, very limited. So I think it's becoming more difficult to do field work. This was pre-COVID. I think after COVID, for a lot of my students, my PhD students, were operating on the assumption that they won't be able to travel to China to do social science research for the foreseeable future.
I'm really afraid we have to leave it there. We're out of time. I want to thank you all very, very profoundly. Nelson, Mara, Maggie, Rory, thank you. This has been a terrific panel, and I hope that everyone in the audience has enjoyed it. I apologize for not getting to more of the audience questions, but stick around. We're here all day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.